Good afternoon. I'm going to have the panelists come up and just grab a seat anywhere, and I'll introduce them as Dave and Greg and Don. Thank you for hosting Citizen 7 and EDGE. As Dave alluded to, I think our city's known for two things, maybe three: racing, amateur athletics, life sciences. But very quietly, we're starting to get a national reputation for innovation in public education. And I hope you come away from today's conversation, and we'll try to keep it as conversational as possible on why that is. The panelists here that we've assembled really represent a large reason why that's true. And they will tell you that they're actually following on the steps of another generation of leaders before them that started this ball. And there's been other cities that have attempted to how to turn around public education. Clearly under Bloomberg, New York City was featured prominently. After Katrina, New Orleans. The unique thing about Indianapolis is the education reform that's happening here has actually sustained itself through multiple administrations and multiple now generations of leaders. And that's incredibly rare in our country. You can see pockets of success and the new leadership, turnover in administration, a public election, and those reforms start to grind to a halt. And you don't see that here. Rather than reading the bios of each person, I'll tell you a quick story. They don't even know what I'm going to say about each of them in terms of how I met them, and that'll give you a little bit of perspective on them. I'll start with Brandon. Brandon Brown, immediately to my right, your left, is the CEO of the Mind Trust. The first time I met Brandon, when you meet Brandon, you walk into his office and you're like thinking, is this bring your child to work day? Like, where's your father? I want to meet him. Despite his youthful experience, posture, he actually has a tremendous amount of wisdom and experience. And literally my first day after we moved into the city, he wanted to meet because there was some negative press about some of the work Matchbook had done in some other cities, and he wanted to talk about it. And I wasn't sure how that meeting was going to go because I didn't know Brandon very well. But from that point and several other points in between, he said, look, I'm really sorry that the media is taking this sort of position against you, but I'm with you. And he's been consistently with us throughout that. And that's just the kind of commitment and loyalty. And you need people in the city like that to bring other people outside the city in. And Brandon does that really well. Next to Brandon is Patrick McAllister. Patrick is in charge of the Office of Education Innovation for the Mayor's Office, essentially our deputy mayor over education. Patrick came into that role kind of halfway through the year that we were here 2 years ago. And as soon as he got into that role, a few weeks later, he reached out and said, hey, can we grab coffee? And I said, sure. We sit down for coffee, and the next thing I know, he pulls out this notepad and he starts taking copious notes of everything that I'm saying. And I'm saying, what are you doing? And he said, I'm taking notes. And I said, why are you doing that? And he says, well, I want to be able to follow up on some of these things. A couple of weeks later, I had to call him. He picks up his cell phone and answers it right away. And that was just a pattern. Every time I've called him, within 24 hours, he calls me back. He's quietly destroying the notion of city government bureaucracy in terms of the government service that he's doing. But he's probably one of the quietest people up in the panel, but he's actually very thoughtful. And he takes the time to get to understand what your problems are, and then he follows up on how those problems are trying to be solved. Very unusual in most city government officials that I've met with in other cities, but I think he's a great representative of our city here. So thanks for being here. Next to him is Dr. Kenith Britt. Ken Britt is he heads up the education college at Marian University. The first time I met Dr. Britt, I drove up onto Marian's campus, and if you've ever been there, it's probably the most unimpressive set of college buildings you could find. And you snake your way back into the School of Ed, you snake your way up to the top floor, you get into this conference room, and I'm meeting with him, and he is literally in this very nondescript room in a very nondescript building, blowing my mind away on how he is revamping teachers' education. The way that they're thinking about preparing the next generation of teachers, they've completely revamped the model to be more like a medical residency. He'll talk a little bit more about that later, but really one of the innovative bright spots we have in the city. Next to him is Kevin Kubaki. So I met Kevin before I moved to Indianapolis when I was kind of on a, let's call it a scouting trip. And I was talking to Brandon and the Mind Trust about potentially coming here. I grabbed lunch with Kevin. So Kevin heads up Neighborhood Charter Network Schools, and they have 2 schools. One is a charter school from scratch that they literally created, and the other is they took over a low-performing IPS school. And I got set up with this lunch with Kevin, and I thought, well, this might be kind of weird. He's a charter leader. I'm thinking of coming into town to do a charter school turnaround. Would he view me as competition? He was completely the opposite. I came a couple months later and spoke at an event. As soon as I finished speaking, Kevin was the first guy up from the audience, shaking my hand, saying, I can't wait till you get here. We get here literally every other month. Kevin and I grab lunch, and we hang out. And no sense of competition, competitive space. It's like, how can I help you? Glad you're here. Again, representing in some ways what everybody in this room represents, which is the best of Hoosier hospitality. So great to have you, Kevin. And then last but not least is, if you haven't been reading the press, is our IPS Interim Superintendent, Aleesia Johnson. Great to have you. Prior to her current interim role, she was the Chief Innovation Officer for the district, which meant that I got to interface with her quite a bit because what she does is, prior to her current role, she was over the portfolio schools that were innovative, whether they be charter schools, independent charters, or autonomous schools within the district. My favorite story with her is we were at this state board hearing, and it was a very official hearing where they were thinking of restarting Wendell Phillips School 63, our school, and she was presenting on what the plan was for that, and then I would follow her to present why Matchbook would be the option to do that restart. And so, formal state board hearing, state board of panelists, and an entire audience of 3 people. These state board hearings aren't exactly riveting. 2 of those people were her children. Oh, sorry, 3 of them. So they were the entire audience. So here she and I are presenting to this room of like essentially state board bureaucrats and her 3 kids. And she's up there, she goes first, she presents, and I'm watching her and I'm watching her kids, and I'm watching her and I'm watching her kids. She sits down, and I said, man, they're really well behaved. How much did you bribe them? And she's like, you have no idea. And that's just emblematic. You can imagine starting a charter school, turning over a failing school. There are many points of, let's just call it, bureaucratic tension in order to traverse that pathway. And the thing you want when you're working with someone on the other side is someone that has a sense of humor, that always sees the bright side of things and carries themselves with class. And that's exactly what Aleesia does. So great to have you. So please give a welcome to the entire panel. So I thought to let the audience get to know each of you a little bit, I want to start off with a question. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and here's the question. How many siblings do you have, and what number are you in? And what was your family's perception of education growing up? Did they value it? Did they not? And when did you know you wanted to have a career in education?
Is it on? Yeah. So first off, I just really appreciate Sajan being such a grandfatherly figure to me.
That's right. Good payback.
All right, we're even.
We're even.
Yeah. So I'm the oldest of 5 kids. I have 4 younger siblings. And there's a full generation between me and my youngest sister. And I'll kind of circle back to that in a second. So growing up, my family is from Greenwood, so we went to Center Grove schools. We grew up about a mile south of the county line. And, we lived in a very middle-class neighborhood that had access to pretty high-quality schools, not a lot of diversity. And, when I look back, the concept of school choice really didn't even hit me because most folks, kind of went to the neighborhood school. A few folks went to Roncalli if they were Catholic, but, generally folks in my neighborhood went to Center Grove. And it wasn't until I was a senior in college when my family chose to adopt a little girl. And so my sister, she was born in China. She was left on the side of the road because of the one-child policy when she was little. And she lived in an orphanage for about the first 13 years of her life. And my mom and dad adopted her into my family when I was a senior. And that was right around the time where I was trying to figure out what the heck I wanted to do with my life. And I met with a Teach for America recruiter around the same time this was happening. And it just hit me that my little sister, who was born on the other side of the world, and had the opportunity now to be adopted into a middle-class American family with access to high-quality public schools, that was great. And that was really a ticket for her to live a life of opportunity. And it just struck me that there's millions of kids in our country who lack that same access, who, through no fault of their own, have an education system and an economic system and a political system that just wasn't created for them. And primarily those are students of color and many students from low-income backgrounds. And it just struck me as fundamentally unfair that my sister, who, kind of by sheer luck, was adopted into a family that had access to good schools, and there were millions of kids who didn't. So that's when I said, I'm going to do something about it. And then I was a teacher for a couple of years in St. Louis, 9th grade English. I won't go into the full story, but there were these 4 walls in my classroom that just irritated the heck out of me. And I quickly found that my students were as smart and as capable as any students in the country. But there were systemic barriers that were the reasons why they didn't have the same opportunities that I had and my sister had. And again, I wanted to do something about it. I'm a really impatient person. And I quickly realized that, yes, it's incredibly important to have high-quality teachers. It's incredibly important to have high-quality schools. But there are systemic reasons why our education system doesn't work for all kids. And I kind of committed myself to that point to working towards solutions at the system level. So we're able to break down generational barriers that many of our students of color have to face every day.
So I'm the oldest of 5 also. And I come from a family of helpers. My father ran a community mental health center. My mother was a nurse. And as I was growing up, my father and my mother would go to work and help people and then come home and take care of us. And as I got older, my grandparents moved in with us. And so my parents would go to work and then come home and take care of us. About the time I moved out, my mom got sick. So my dad would go to work and then come home and take care of my mom. So for 60 years of his life, that's all my father did. He went to work and came home to take care of family members. And that kind of like core value of helping, I think animated why I wanted to get into education. I've learned a lot and know that helping takes a lot of different forms, but I think that's what's kind of animated me to do this work.
Thank you for the ringing endorsement of our facilities.
I'm helping you with your future capital campaign.
I was going to say that we are willing to take donations for a new building. Where most of our investments go, though. It's in student scholarships. Thank you for the question. It's a great question. I love talking about my story. I'm the 3rd of 8 children. Your typical American family today. My mom and dad had 4 kids together, and then they had 4 additional kids separately after they divorced. My mom, the kids the siblings I grew up with, it was 4 of us in the house, single mom, 4 kids. We grew up on public assistance, grew up in a housing project. And so we never talked about, we never went to the library. I never read a book. We never did anything. I'm not disparaging my mother, by the way. It was crisis of the moment, But I started going to college visits when I was in 11th grade, as you can imagine, to get out of school, because you're allowed to get so many college visits, right? But it was a great opportunity, and I think it's a great opportunity for our young people, because if you never understand that culture and you never see it, you don't know that you belong. I never thought that I belonged in college until I visited campuses and I sat in the classroom and I thought, wow, these kids look like me. They talk like me. The professor isn't, talking in Hebrew. I'm pretty good. So that's, the decision was the turning point of visiting colleges. And then, for those who are faith-filled in this room, there was a person who was taking me on these college campuses. When I made the decision, I want to go to college, said, Ken, you know what you are? You're a teacher. And that was like a lightning bolt moment for me that said, yeah, I think that's a great career for me. So it's been a wonderful career.
Thanks, Sajan. So my mom was actually a pre-K teacher as I was growing up. I spent a lot of time going to her classes and basically just playing with the kids in the pre-K. And ultimately, I think my truest answer is I just really like kids. And so I ended up becoming a teacher after a stint in international marketing that I decided, I'm not so sure working in office is for me. But I would say getting into education in the way I have now was a slightly different experience for me. I was teaching at the time, but I was doing some religious education work in Hawville. And as I was getting to know these families and these kids at night, I really started hearing a consistent message of the parents didn't trust the schools that they were sending their kids to. And I never went to a failing school myself. I don't really know what that experience is like, but I do know what it's like to have kids, because I've got 3 of my own. And I remember very well walking each one of my kids up to kindergarten on that first day. And in the back of my mind, just praying that the school would see my kids the way I did. Right? I got some quirky kids. I don't want them to change. I want you to make them the best version of themselves. And so to hand off the best thing you have to a school takes a lot of trust. And so to hear these parents not trust the schools, it made me angry. And so I started digging into what it would take to open a school that would honor the trust that the parents are putting into in giving the school when they hand off their kids each day. So that's what we did. And the fastest venue for that was to open our first charter school in La Salle Academy on the west side. So that was really what kind of was the impetus behind where I am today.
Your siblings.
Oh, sorry. I'm the oldest of 2.
Hi, great to be with you all today. I am also the oldest of 2. I have a younger brother. And similar to Patrick, I think I come from a family of servant leaders, truly. So my mother is a current elementary school principal. She's a principal in Evansville, Indiana. My grandfather was an educator for all of his career. My grandmother was a teacher's assistant. My other grandmother was my Sunday school teacher. My aunt's a chaplain. I mean, it's just kind of in our family that you serve. Either you do that as your vocation or you do that through your service outside of your professional life. And so that's really a core value that I've been raised around. And I think, I was not looking particularly to education. I knew I wanted to be in a helping profession, but watched my mom teach and just the love that she had for her students and the relationships she had. My god brother now is actually one of her former students. And so seeing what she was able to do, the impact she was able to make, the connections and relationships she was able to build was something that I wanted to do too. And I also love kids and young people, and there's an optimism and hope that you have, an energy that you get from kids that you just can't get other places. And so that really inspired me to do the work in being in education. It's been a great 16 years.
Great. So one of the great things about the audience that's here is some of you are deeply involved in education, but most of you are not. And I think one of the challenging things is when you are not in it, it's actually very difficult to discern what are the key drivers, what are the key levers for transforming education. Most of the stuff that you read tends to be fairly negative around what's happening in public education nationwide. And it's beyond the capacity of a single panel to distill for you all the things that are both good and not good in education. So here's what I wanted to do to try to give you a little bit of insight into each of these leaders. I'm going to ask them each the same question, which is, imagine for a moment that there's someone in the audience that is going to write you a check at the end of this lunch. And that check is going to be north of $1 million and south of $5 million. It's a big number. But here's the caveat. You can only spend it on one thing, one initiative. You have to pick one lever for change. Now, we know there's no silver bullet in education, but what the audience should hear is, what do you most believe is the most fundamental, dramatic lever that you could invest in to transform the work that you're involved in? So if someone was to give you that, and this is a hypothetical, but if there is somebody with that kind of cash in the room, come see me after the lunch. But maybe we'll start at the end, Aleesia, since you have the mic. What would be your dramatic lever for transforming public education?
I think it would be sort of twofold, both the hiring of extremely talented individuals and then the development to support them in getting better at their work. Like this work, education rests on talent and having very passionate, skilled, committed, capable people who can lay out a vision and then rally a team around them to execute against that vision. It doesn't work if you don't have the people to do the work.
Yep, that. No, that would be my answer, though, is we just need to continue to find and develop great teachers. There's nothing more important in a classroom or in the development of a child in their educational process than amazing teachers. And I think that if we could continue to develop them, and we've got some good things going on and some good people coming up, hopefully through Marion in their nondescript buildings. But I think that they'll have low expectations when they get to the school. But having the great people is absolutely paramount. I will give a slightly different alternative, is building out the extent to which we are connecting schools or giving schools the ability to connect with the community resources that exist in their communities. There are lots of people who want to help, but not really strong avenues for connecting all those people right now. So I think that would actually help in a lot of different ways, and particularly with the sustainability of those great people in the classrooms.
Apparently we need new buildings. So I'm going to use the $1 to $5 million to have a new school of ed. It's interesting. I think that the most important thing that I would do, and if I could only do one thing, would be to create an identification, development, and support system for educational leaders. And so every school will thrive with a strong leader, and that's just the case for business as well. For those of you who are in the business field, if there's something, venture capital makes a lot of money every year buying struggling businesses, typically because they're either under-resourced or they have weak leadership. Schools are no different. We need strong leaders in every single building. Teachers will not work for underperforming principals for very long. And if we could do one thing, that would be the one thing I would do.
So ditto everything. I think the one thing I'd like to add, and this goes to a little bit what Kevin was talking about, there are a lot of non-school factors that affect a child when they go into a building, and often schools are holding the responsibility of providing for those non-school factors. They have food pantries. They invite in community partners who can provide a whole host of services for those schools, but it pulls people away from the teaching and learning part that school leaders and teachers are so core and essential to. So if we could set up an approach that provides connectivity for students, that every child had connection to resources that they need, that would alleviate some of the stress that school leaders have every day trying to serve students, while also ensuring that every unique child gets the resources that they need. And in my mind, that's what equity is.
Yeah, so I agree with all that. I think especially in terms of what Aleesia said, almost word for word, I would have said that. So I'm gonna flip the question a little bit. Sorry. So I don't think $1 to $5 million is near enough. When we think about our nation's most intractable problems, we oftentimes skimp when it comes to putting in resources and talent towards really big solutions. And I think a lot about, in our city right here, we said we were going to be the sports capital of the world, and the civic community and neighborhoods and political leaders, et cetera, all rallied around making that happen, and we're now the sports capital of the world. I think we have an opportunity in education to do something very similar that no other city in the country has. And just think for a minute, if all 200 of you made education equity your issue, not just with your checkbooks, but we could probably raise some pretty significant money in this room, but with your talents and your treasure, and to be just really honest with you, your privilege, right? And kind of leverage and lean into that privilege enough so that we're able to spread equity in terms of access for education across the city. And just think about then if all 200 of you got 10 of your friends in your network, and then they got 10 more, and they got 10 more, then you're really talking about, a real social movement. But the last kind of piece of that is that what I'm learning more and more in this work is, at the end of the day, any social movement has to be led by those that are most impacted by the injustice. So we need to make sure, as folks in this room that have privilege, we are authentically seeking out folks who are directly impacted by the racism that we see in society. And we need to listen, and we need to be responsive, and then we need to eventually make sure that we're following their lead. So that's one shift that I think we're late in the game to get to at the Mind Trust, but I think we are realizing that for this to really be a movement, and for this to really be a social movement that sticks, and for Indianapolis to be the first city in the country to transform our education system, all of us in this room are going to have to be humble enough to be able to listen to those folks that are most impacted, much more than we have historically.
So I want to look at the other side of that question, which is if that's and that's pretty unique, amazing convergence on the panel, I think, in terms of the lever for change. What's the key barrier? What in your current job? What perplexes you? What stumps you about your job? Where do you find on the weekend when you're grocery shopping that your mind is drifting to this problem? Give the audience some insight around the thing that's really vexing you that you're trying to solve, either a key barrier, constraint, or challenge that you just keep pushing against and can't seem to solve quite yet. Anybody can go.
I think the key issue that I face, every day as the head of our education program is the perceived value of higher ed in the United States today, and second, the nobility of the teaching profession, right? I mean, the value placed on the teaching profession isn't where it needs to be in American society. And that is a big barrier that is going to be a sea change of a culture that needs to be multiple layers, right? Not just, what we do differently at one university or every university. It's an entire culture that needs to change, because there is nothing more important than that teacher outside of the home, nothing more important than that teacher standing in front of the kids every single day.
Dr. Britt, is there a country that does that well?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the top high, what I call the 5 high flyers, you've heard these before: Singapore, Finland, South Korea, China, and Canada. I mean, these are the ones that are doing really, really well. When you look at the outperforming, and they're not spending more money. That's the irony here. And the teachers, in some cases, make more money in some of those countries, but in others, it's relatively the same. But that professional esteem is much, much higher. They treat teachers more similar to an attorney than they do what they do in the United States. So it's really interesting.
There's a lot of things that worry me and probably make me lose sleep. One of them, though, that has been a big challenge in this work for a long time, and I actually feel really hopeful about. And if you would have told me I would have felt hopeful about this even 6 months ago, I would have said you were crazy. And Marion has been a national trailblazer on this front, is that our teacher preparation programs, both traditional and non-traditional, just historically have not done a great job in terms of preparing our teachers to be as successful as they can be. And I think, just honestly, that's been specifically true when you talk about higher ed. And Marion, 10 years ago, when Teach for America came here, was the only local university that raised their hand and said, we're going to partner with them. And if you think about Ken Britt and his team around their transformation of their School of Education, it's one of very few schools of ed in the country that is trying something radically different. And what we're seeing now is, I don't like to use the word market, but the higher ed market is shifting. We have a group of progressive, forward-thinking School of Ed deans in our city that has just not been true in the past. Almost every single local School of Ed has somebody leading the School of Ed that is willing to think about teacher prep differently and is ready to partner in new ways. And I'm actually really hopeful that this is going to be kind of a teacher prep revolution that starts here in Indy, and I think could have a lot of real national consequences. And I'm not just saying it because you're on the panel, Ken, but I think Marion undoubtedly has been the trailblazer in that, and I think their work is now impacting several schools of ed across the city.
So our first school was charter school, and one of the benefits of having that kind of grassroots charter school early on is, you can do the slow growth, build the community that way, and we've had between 80 and 90% retention of our students year over year, which is really strong. And then our second school, we restarted one of the lowest performing elementary schools in IPS. And I think that has given me a greater appreciation for the challenges that the traditional public schools face on a day-to-day basis. So for perspective, whereas we're over 80% retention with our students at Enlace, at Kendesi, our second school, it's about 42%. And so the reality of that is you've got 60% of your students coming in or churning year over year, and it's tough to ever really get your footing because you're constantly trying to rebuild culture, constantly trying to catch kids up. You don't know from which school they came from, and unfortunately, a lot of the transiency occurs within the same types of schools that tend to be focused around neighborhoods that have the housing complexes that will evict large groups of people at one time. So I think the housing insecurity issue presents a huge challenge to us on top of not a strong communication system between schools. So when we get a student, we don't have a really good understanding of the things the other school has tried with them to help them, like the supports they've put in place. We don't know what worked, what didn't work, what the specific needs are. As you can imagine, families can be hesitant towards coming and asking schools for help. And so there's just a lot of unknown when students are coming to us. So that creates just constant questions and challenges. I do think, though, I'm hopeful about the movement that we've started here and the direction we're going, in which under a lot of Aleesia's leadership at the district, the charters in the district are starting to work together now. We're starting to think about old problems in new ways. But I think this is a big one to tackle, and it takes much more than just the people in education to do it.
I'll add to that, because I think that's exactly right. As I think about the challenges for IPS, I think the example that Kevin highlighted is, there's a trade-off at district leadership to every decision you make. And so I could think about what Kevin shared and say, what's within my locus of control is we could do something to change our transportation system, for instance. We could say, a student who is that transient, we can commit to still providing transportation to them, within a certain zone or something like that, so there's some consistency in their educational experience. There's a cost to that. And so what would the trade-off be? Right now, we have extracurricular transportation for our students who are athletes. So everyone has a chance to participate because they know there's a bus that can take them home. So I could trade that off. I could say, you know what, we're gonna sort of be committed to trying to stabilize the transiency we see in a number of our schools, but the trade-off of that might be we can't do extracurricular transportation for students, and now I've created an equity for students who have access to those things, which they need to have a holistic educational experience. And then a part of me also questions, like, is that actually the answer, or is the answer that housing insecurity needs to be addressed? Because if we could solve it at the root, I wouldn't have to figure out how to, twist myself into a pretzel to fix the transiency issue. And so that's something as a leader I wrestle with a lot is, are we getting to the actual systemic cause of the issue, or are we sort of patching Band-Aids over Band-Aids over Band-Aids and feeling good about having that solution, but ultimately not getting to root causes? And so the problem pops up in a new way, not long down the road. And that's a very serious challenge. So I think our country, to Brandon's point, needs to decide if we're really, truly going to be committed to addressing the root causes of a lot of the issues that our students bring into our schools every day.
So I'll just add one little bit in that I think we have a lot of school leaders who are great instructional leaders and folks who want to focus on school curriculum. But part of autonomy is having to handle a whole lot of other problems that your training may not have provided you with opportunities to learn about. Now, we have great entrepreneurial leaders who are willing to tackle all of those problems, but to some, it takes away from the teaching and learning part. So I think the more the districts and the charter sector can collaborate and work together and wash away that distinction between a traditional public and a public charter school, and there can be operational supports kind of across the board, and you allow leaders and teachers the ability to do what they do best, which is teaching and learning, I think we're going to have a much better system. We're doing a lot of work around those areas, and we're finding ways to collaborate more to make everything kind of work together. But it's still something that I'm concerned about, and something that I think we as leaders need to continue to think about what is best what is best at the school level for the student, and how we can provide kind of operational support for all of that.
So we've talked a little bit about key levers for change in education, and we talked a little bit about key constraints. Let's switch now and talk about key opportunity. There was a recent study that came out of Stanford called the CREDO report that actually looked at Indianapolis over the prior 3 years in terms of our academic results of our public schools. Brandon, maybe for the audience, just unpack in layman's terms, what were the key findings of this independent report?
Yeah, so at least at the Mind Trust, and I think most folks in this panel, we think that there are 3 key conditions that need to be true for a school to have the maximum chance to be successful. 1 is a transformative school leader. 2 is the autonomy to make school-based decisions as close to kids as possible. And then 3 is rigorous, transparent accountability. So, we want to invest and support any school, regardless of what you call it, that has those 3 conditions. And, so how it's kind of played out here in the city is that the innovation schools and IPS and the charter schools, most of which are authorized out of the mayor's office, all legally have school-based autonomy and rigorous accountability. And then our role at the Mind Trust, as one of many partners, is to make sure that we have as much high-quality talent as possible to leverage that autonomy. So what the CREDO report did, and this is actually the 5th study out of Stanford University that has measured school performance here, is it showed that schools that have contractual autonomy are gaining significantly in terms of academics relative to their peers. So in math and English, it's between 80 and 100 additional learning days every single school year if you attend a charter school or an innovation school. And if you compound that over the course of a K-12 academic career, that's several years of additional learning. What that doesn't mean is that all charters are great or all innovation schools are great, and it doesn't mean that there aren't fantastic schools inside the district, because within the spread of school performance, you see a lot of overlap. But generally speaking, at a system level, that's what they found. And there's not a city in the country that has the charter sector and the district working in such a collaborative way as what we see in Indianapolis. It is literally unheard of, and the work, it might not seem like it to us, but the work here is being looked at across the country now as a model. And so it's really exciting. I think we're showing amazing progress. But the flip side, the kind of harsh reality, is that we still have way too many students who lack the educational opportunities that they deserve. We have way too many students that are in low-performing schools of all sectors. And while our city over the last 20 years has made tons of progress, we need to continue that progress, and we need to continue to put pressure on the system to continue to make the hard decisions to ensure that all of our kids, regardless of their race, their income, or their zip code, have access to a great education. And I am super hopeful, in large part because of the leadership out of the district and the mayor's office. And I am specifically so grateful for the interim superintendent over here, who as a city, we should just be incredibly proud to have somebody of Aleesia's caliber and heart leading the district. And there are a lot of cities across the country that would kill to have somebody like Aleesia leading their school system. So I would just, again, encourage the 200 folks in this room to make sure that we are continuing as leaders in this city to make sure that the progress that's been made over 20 years does not stall, does not backslide, and continues. Because I'm actually incredibly confident that 10, 15 years from now, this work will be so much closer to ensuring that all of our kids have access to a good school, and the national ramifications of that are really hard to comprehend.
Aleesia, do you feel like the report validates your prior, when you were Chief Innovation Officer and now Interim Superintendent, do you feel like there was a validation of the strategy and the approach? Does it galvanize you to keep pressing on? Is there anything in the report that the report didn't say that would cause you concern? How did you personally react to the report?
Yeah, I think we were encouraged is probably the best word to use. When the work started, it had not been done before anywhere in the country. And so one of the common criticisms was, you're experimenting on children, and how do you know it's going to work? And this isn't proven. And so to have data come back from an external organization and source to say it is working was encouraging. To Brandon's point, the reality is, if you look at just absolute proficiency of students, we still have a really long way to go. And so I'm encouraged, but I am not satisfied because we still have too many students who are not at the level that we would want them to be, that we want our own children to be at. And so until, I feel confident that I could say every single student in our district I would send my child to without hesitation, I won't be satisfied.
One quick thing to add to all of this, and ditto both what Brandon and Aleesia said. There is an IUPUI School of Education study that also came out around the time that CREDO came out that found substantially similar data to the CREDO study about mayor-sponsored charter schools. But what I really wanted to also point out is beyond the K-12 sector, there are hundreds of thousands of adults in Indiana who do not have a high school diploma. And we have schools in Marion County, including the Excel Centers, with Ken Kramer as the CEO of Goodwill. He and his team are leading the charge on that, who are transforming lives of not only the individuals getting the diploma, but their families. You have people graduating from high school with industry credentials that will allow them to have a choice-filled life and will allow their children to have a lot more breathing room as it relates to their connectivity to poverty. And if you want to learn more about it, I would highly recommend the Netflix documentary Night School that documents the lives of 3 Excel Center students to give you a good sense of this transformational work. I know we've been talking a lot about K-12, but I would be remiss if we didn't shout out that amazing work of the charter leaders at Goodwill.
Dr. Britt, a key way that we keep this momentum going and build on our past successes will be developing a next generation of educators. What's wrong with the traditional way that educators learn how to become teachers, and what are you doing at Marion to change that?
Well, going back to one of Brandon's comments earlier, I think he was a little generous on the School of Ed condition across the country. It's actually not good at all, and I speak from a position of School of Ed. When you look at just the turnover rate of teachers is just mind-boggling. Almost half the teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years of their career. So 1 in 2 people were leaving. If you compare that to the rest of the world, it's about double. You can imagine if Aleesia had a strong, consistent work pool of talented teachers, she could save millions of dollars that could be invested into other areas. So I think that the way that schools of ed have operated traditionally has not changed, honestly, in about 40 or 50 years. A little tinkering here and there will get the students out early in doing field placements, but at the end of the day, it's still not what it needs to be. Second is the type of student that we have allowed to get into the School of Education, is something that we really need to look at. Number one is the teaching workforce does not represent the student body demographically that they serve. About 7.5% to 8% of the teachers are teachers of color, compared to 40% in the state. We have to change that. I know every other discipline, for those of you in here in the business community, you're talking about engineers and lawyers, and Marion has a medical school, so we want that too. But until you fix the teacher issue, we will continue to struggle as a society with expanding opportunities for young people from diverse backgrounds to experience the wealth generation that has happened in this country. It's not uncommon for an African-American male to never have an African-American male teacher in 13 years of an educational experience, not to mention college, and we won't go there. That has to change. We also need to make sure that we raise the bar of entrance in schools of ed, similar to a medical school or getting into law school or even nursing school. So I think some of the things that we've changed is we're targeting students. Students of color who want to go in the education profession. Our Latino population has grown dramatically. Our African American population has grown dramatically. Our Burmese population has grown dramatically in terms of those who want to pursue teaching. And when we go into these schools, whether it's IPS, any of the IPS schools or anything around the country, around the state, we talk about the nobility of the profession. And it's something that I would encourage each of you to think about. Who was your favorite teacher? Who impacted your life the most as a teacher? And you can start thinking about that person. We need every person going through a school of ed to be the favorite teacher. So we have changed our model for recruiting, developing. We are very similar to an apprenticeship type model. The first year that the students come on campus, they go through a simulation lab. Some of you have been through our teaching simulation lab. Our students start teaching avatars, which is really cool. We don't want them working on real kids first, right? Just like our physicians in training. So starting from that point all the way through their final year, we want them to constantly teach, perfect the art of teaching. For those of you who have taught or are teaching now, it is not easy. But we need to help prepare them so that they don't leave. And more importantly, that they provide a great service for the young people that they interact with every day. So I always talk about no grace period. Our kids deserve a teacher to be highly effective the first day they step foot in the classroom, not 3 years later. Yeah, they'll be an expert maybe within 3 or 4 or 5 years, but they better be highly effective that first year. Part of that is the residency process, similar to what we do in medical school. When you finish your medical degree, you go in to a residency. If it's good enough for doctors, why isn't it good enough for educators? So we've embedded that residency period, which is the 5th year. Our program is a 5-year program. That final year, they're in a partner school, several partner schools here today, so that they can learn under a skilled master teacher, learn how to be the best, so that then when they ultimately take over their classroom, they are the best.
Aleesia, you arguably have the hardest job up here. All of your decisions are vetted through a board in a public meeting that is open to the public and the press. It can often feel when you read the press that people are watching and waiting for your mistake or failure rather than rooting for your success and win. If you are asked to be the permanent superintendent, why would you consider it, and why would you say yes?
So I've lived in this community since 2002, and I care deeply about Indianapolis. If the opportunity was to present itself, and if I were to decide to apply for that opportunity, I, have been in the education space in the city since 2004, and I just believe. I mean, I know that sounds really maybe cliche, but I deeply believe in what is possible for our city. And I was raised by folks who, say to whom much is given, much is required. I believe that. I had an excellent educational experience. I am a black woman in this city, and I understand what it means for young black men and women in this city, the systemic barriers that already come against them. And so when you're talking about a district like IPS that is full of black and brown children, I think the question is, how could I not feel compelled and committed and deeply invested in the success of the young people in our city? Because as they go, so will our city go. So that is just the reality of the situation. And I have a lot of hope for our city. I was in the charter sector for the majority of my time in Indianapolis, and so to see the ways in which we are collaborating and communicating, and it is not easy. It is really tough. So we can sit on the panel and kind of, talk about all the progress we've made, and we have. It's been amazing, and yet we have so much farther to go. And it's really, really hard work, very, very difficult. But at the end of the day, it's about our students getting the best education possible. And I'm just committed and believe that it is possible. And so, really the question is, how could I not?
Great answer. I want to ask one last question, and then I think we'll probably open it up for some Q&A from the audience. So this is a room full of people. They're gonna finish lunch, and they're gonna go back to their day jobs, and someone at work is gonna say, "Hey, what'd you do at lunch?" So my question for each of the panelists is, what's one thing they should share with a coworker who may not be all that familiar with what's happening in public education in our city? And I'll say this too, that's a momentary action they can take. I also know that this room is full of people of faith who believe fundamentally, and sometime in the next 24, 48 hours, will pray, as they always do, and ask for God's blessing on this city and this next generation of children. What should they pray for? How can they be helpful? Here's your pitch opportunity to get more people empowered to make Indianapolis a city known for education. What would be your charge? Give them something to go back to work and share, and give them something to think, pray, reflect on over a longer period of time.
I can start. Also, as a person of deep faith, I would say pray for your leaders. If you're going to make a prayer, pray for your leaders and for their wisdom, and that they are sort of guided in their decision-making to be wise and to be discerning in their decisions. I think what I would ask you to do when you go back is to ask yourself, how many people in your everyday life do you talk to or do you know about who don't look like you, who don't come from the same background as you, who don't live in your neighborhood, and ask yourself, why is that? And then make it an explicit goal and intention of yours to go out and talk to someone who does not share your same experience, background, economic background, racial background, to get to know them as people. Because what I find is it's very easy to talk about these things in the abstract, and then to kind of say that's somebody else's problem to solve. It becomes much harder to do that when you are talking to someone personally, when you build that connection with them, to then sort of disinvest yourself from their experience. So I would just say to reach out and to make it a point to get to know someone who is not like you. And maybe take them with you to go see a school and go see some of the amazing work we have happening in our classrooms for our students.
So one of the things I would encourage you to do is to think about that person who impacted your life the most and talk about that, with your colleagues. Several months ago, I was with Gary Brackett, and we were talking about educators and the importance of educators. And he offered a really interesting idea of a social media campaign that we're actually going to do. So I'll give Gary credit for that. And I'm having a meeting with the Pacers next week. to talk about, people of authority or people of a position of respect in the community, whether it's an athlete, or a mayor or Patrick, who can just do a quick, just a quick 10-second, 20-second video of their favorite teacher. We need to go through a social exercise in this country to raise the level of the esteem of the education profession. And it's only going to happen when you have people who are athletes. So, for example, if Victor Oladipo gets on and does a Facebook, live thing or whatever, on YouTube that says, hey, this was my favorite teacher and this is why. And then if you do it and we all start doing that, I think it will open up, the floodgates of people, really being interested in education. So I think that, we have to do better. These teachers are nation builders, and we need to give them respect. But we also need to make sure that kids who are interested in education feel that support.
So I would encourage everyone to not think about school type as much and think more about what each individual school is doing. We have transformational schools that are doing amazing things for kids. We have a school that has a very Afrocentric curriculum. We have a school that is dual language. We have schools that focus on math and science. We have schools that focus on liberal arts. But we don't talk about those things. And I use we as the sort of collective education conversation. We talk about school type. And I think when we talk about school type, we erase the hard work that schools are doing and what each individual type of school has, not to use that term, but what they all do kind of at an essence. Their educational philosophy, their models, those are erased when we create artificial lines around traditional public and public charter schools. So I think we need to have a more elevated and complicated conversation about the individual qualities of schools while also focusing on ensuring that all schools are held to a high standard.
Something really tangible. I would go to the Indiana Department of Education website. If I knew what it was, I would tell you, but you can just Google it. Compass. And then I would click on Compass, which is the data center for all schools and school systems across the state. And I would then type in Washington Township, a school system that maybe many of you live in, maybe you send your kids to, and that I think we generally think is a high-performing school district. And then I would look at the state test results, and if you click on the graph, it'll take you down into subgroups. And I encourage you to compare the outcomes for African-American students relative to white students. What you will find is, hopefully, is appalling to you. And then the question should be, is one group of kids that look a certain way that much more brilliant than the other? Hopefully the answer is no. The next question, what are the reasons for these outcomes? If it's not the kid's fault, which it's not, then what are the in-school reasons for that? What are the out-of-school reasons for that? And I would get really convicted on a couple of the reasons that you think lead to that inequity, and I would make it your mission to make meaningful progress on the issues that you choose. And then I would search for the Paramount School of Excellence, one of many schools in our city of all kinds of types. And I would drill into their ISTEP results. And I would compare their student demographics to the ones that you see in Washington Township. This is not an anti-Washington Township thing, but. And then I would go visit Paramount. They have people come in, I think, every Fridays to do tours. And I would visit other high-performing schools of all school types in IPS, charters, innovation schools, in townships. And I would see what they're doing to beat the odds. And then I would become a champion for more schools like that in our city until one day when you go into Compass, you don't see the 50% gap that you see now when you look at results in Washington Township.
So I love the story, the analogy that the old man walks down onto the beach and he just sees starfish that had washed up over that night. And there's just thousands of starfish as far as he can see in either direction. And there's this one little boy, and he's down there and he's throwing them back in. Picking them up, throwing it back in, picking it up, throwing it back in. And that old man kind of jadedly walks over and says, "Young man, what are you doing? There are thousands of starfish here on this beach. You know, you can't possibly save them all. It's just what you're doing is not going to make a difference." And he looks down, he throws the starfish into the sea, and he said, "Made a difference to that one." I think this can be overwhelming, right? The work, the need in Indianapolis can be overwhelming. And if you think of it as trying to save education in Indianapolis or change it or fix it, that can just be too much for any one person. So my advice would be seek out a way to just change one life. Find those mentoring programs. There's one called the Starfish Initiative, coincidentally, here in Indianapolis. You know, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Boys Club. There's Boys, what's that? Edge, yeah. There's plenty of, that's why she's in the running for superintendent and I'm, yeah. But if you look at the research, it shows that students who have a significantly meaningful relationship with adults, the more meaningful relationships they have with adults, the better off they're going to be, right? So be one of those adults, form a meaningful, positive relationship with a child, and just start changing the world that way.
Man, it's hard to top that. I think what I'll do is instead of I'm gonna give the mic back to Dave, and I know there's a few questions here, but if the panelists can stick for 5 minutes, maybe you can come up individually and ask your question. I just want to close on this, which is I started this panel with a brief story of each person and how I met them, and there was a common thread through that story, each of their stories, which was 2 years ago I didn't know any of them, and I consider them friends now. And one of the beautiful things about Indianapolis when you move here is there's a lack of hierarchy. There's a lack of people are genuinely genuine and their desire to see you do well if they think you're trying to do well. And they will advise you, mentor you, pour their life into you, as each of those examples showed that they were willing to do that. And part of today's sponsors, in the ways that we show love, in the ways that we come alongside and mentor people, is we pour our lives into them. In many ways, the way to solve education has really never changed. It's just about somebody caring about someone else who's a little bit behind them and helping them forward. And I think that the people on the panel represent the very best in the city to do that. And if this thing that we've started is going to become a movement, to Kevin's point, we got to find your starfish and pick it up and put it back in the water. Find that person to mentor, to advise, to come alongside, to share your life with. It could be a kid, it could be a school leader, it could be an educator, an administrator. But if we look at it in that context, we really have to identify one or two people each to actually come alongside. And the problem actually gets solved. It's just a question of will. Do we have the will? And what hopefully they represent today is the will that we're capable of here in Indianapolis. So with that, please thank the panel, and I'll give it back to Dave.